Welcome back to How'd They Do It, Tech in the Cities. This is the seventh episode of our series. And before we start, I just want to thank our sponsors, Uber, Spectrum, Civic Hall, TikTok, Google, DoorDash, and Snapchat. Good morning, Julie.
Hi, Tom.
Sounds like you had a fun episode. Unfortunately, I couldn't be there. Tell us a little bit about the guests and what you guys talked about.
Yeah, this was a really fun conversation. We had Julie Sweet on. She's the Director of Advocacy and Industry Relations for the American Association of Political Consultants Foundation. And we also had Bradley Honan. He's the CEO and president of the Honan Strategy Group. He's a pollster. And we had a really, really interesting conversation about how AI, particularly, but technology beyond AI, is really shaping the business of elections, the business of polling, how we talk to voters, how we get more voters involved. Obviously, it's something that's rapidly changing for all industries, but with this election coming up, it feels particularly acute.
Do you think AI, like in 4 years, can just tell us definitively who's going to be president, like way in advance?
Oh God, I don't know. I didn't ask that question.
I,
It would save a
I'm
lot
just
of grief this week, wouldn't it?
I I really would like to have AI just tell me like, "Okay, Kamala's gonna win. It's gonna take 2 weeks for the counting to happen," and then that way we can all sleep for the next 2 weeks.
That would be really nice. Just wake up and this be done.
That's what I'm
uh,
hoping AI can do one day.
Yeah. One of the things that was really fun and I think really helpful about this conversation I had with Julie and Bradley is that we talked about some of the risks from AI, but we also talked about a lot of the promise of AI and how a lot of these new technologies help people better understand the electorate and maybe talk to more voters. And it's really interesting to think about, the upsides and the downsides of these technologies. Obviously, nothing is super clear cut. We're living in a moment of just significant and rapid change. So it's really fascinating stuff.
Polling's always fascinated me. I actually did some polling when I was in high school and college at NBC, but I remember like something that really stood out for me in 2016. There was only like one polling unit, I think it was Rasmussen, that predicted that Trump was going to win. And why was it? Because they asked people after they asked them, who are you voting for? And they figured there were some people who were going to say, not say Trump because they were afraid to. They then said, who do you think your neighbor's voting for? And
Yeah.
that then was the tell. That's a little AI like, right? It's kind of coming up with some smart question that can actually get around people's deceptiveness or not truth telling.
But that's when people still answered phones.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Exactly. So
Anyway, I'm
I'm
really
glad.
excited for you to hear the conversation with Julie and Bradley. It was super interesting.
Great. Let's pick it up.
Bradley, let me start with you really quickly. There's so much conversation about how technology has changed polling. The obvious way we talk about that is people don't answer their landlines anymore. Everyone's got cell phones and everyone gets a million texts. I'd love to kind of dive in and peel that onion a little bit and talk about what some of the specifics are. Like, how has technology changed polling? What's working and what's not?
Absolutely, Julie. And I'm going to try and answer your question here from two frames, which is how is public opinion polling used to inform campaigns, public affairs fights, but also speak more broadly about civic life in this country and where I see the development and the evolution of artificial intelligence being a really important catalyst to drawing people back into the civic discussion, if you will. I think there's a lot of disinformation about AI, job loss, disinformation. I think there's another side of the story that's not being told as much. One of the things that I think is very important in terms of thinking about public opinion is to consider the Latin word of vox populi, the voice of the people. And what Abraham Lincoln said in terms of with the public on my side and I can accomplish anything, without a public opinion, I can't accomplish anything. I've been a part of bipartisan exit polls around the world in places like Ukraine, places like Venezuela, where authoritarian governments have tried to steal elections. And polling is a very, very critical check and balance on civil society and on democracy. One of the challenges that opinion polling is facing right now is that there is a lot of commercial marketing, spam, robo polling that's causing fewer people to pick up their telephones. We're seeing a big growth of that right now in the cell phone space as well, causing people to engage less. There's also historically low levels of trust in the media right now. And so you would call before for the New York Times poll, the ABC poll, and people would be flattered to be able to share their perspective. There isn't that same level of trust that's enjoyed about the traditional media. One of the other really big important factors is the country, the city, the state is becoming a lot more heterogeneous, both demographically as well as psychographically. It's very, very complicated to think about public opinion and all the nuances of different issues. But public opinion right now is typically, for the average congressional campaign survey, 400 people. And so what that means is if you get a survey that says housing, the affordable housing crisis is the main issue, 4 in 10 cite that. That means a candidate or a campaign will look at that data and say, we're going to run a campaign around affordable housing. By definition, that means 6 in 10 voters are not as animated by that same level of political discourse and are going to opt out. One of the reasons that we're hearing from a lot of voters in the battleground states is that they're not casting a ballot is they don't find these issues to be germane and relevant to their lives. If we burrow down with that 400 example to the number of people that cite the environment, let's say that's 10%. So we're talking about 40 people. And then you cut out the number of people that are interested in clean water and clean air, interested in parks, interested in open space. You start to get very, very small segments of people. There is a group in the city that cares about Amazon deforestation. There are 200,000 special needs, special education students across the city, but each of those are too small of a segment for traditional polling to pick up. What AI gives us the promise to do is instead of conducting those 400 interviews, conducting 4,000 interviews and allowing us to get a richer understanding of the electorate and allow candidates and campaigns to talk directly to voters about the issues they care about. We have developed AI-driven voice bots. We have one named Eleanor. We have a chat bot named Polly. They're able to go out and harvest an enormous amount of data, giving us a very nuanced perspective about different voters and their specific needs, almost an ear to the ground to every single voter. And that's the promise, I think, with AI in terms of re-engaging the public in the civic discourse and the public policy discussions, because you're going to get candidates talking not about these generic issues, but talking to voters about the very things they care about most.
Something you just said strikes me as interesting that I hadn't really thought about. And Julie, maybe you can weigh in on this too. You can imagine a world where if the AI gets good enough, polling and campaigning in some ways will collapse on each other and it will be like almost individual outreach from campaign to voter, like so hyper targeted, right?
That's one of the big considerations, I think, of the industry and of the technology and the tools more broadly is like you have to keep humans in the loop at some point, and having the point of which you're like, I'm going to survey or have a chatbot or a voice bot engage with individual voters and then have the chatbot give them back specified information from the candidate or the issue or the political committee. That kind of efficiency and scale is incredible, but then we lose the power of understanding like what's the human influence and is it giving it accurate information, and do we actually understand how the voters are being influenced by that information? I think that's what a lot of kind of questions need to get to, and where a lot of, at the AAPC, I represent the political consulting industry, which is the advertisers, the pollsters, the fundraisers, the field folks, public affairs professionals. And so I spend a lot of time thinking about kind of the regulatory environment as well as the innovation and how we're going to respond to a lot of this changing technology. I think a lot of what I've watched most recently is we've been very concerned about deep fakes and labeling and transparency and watermarking of content. But I think that is kind of the 2024 question. And I think where we're getting to in the 2025 question and the 2026 question is like, what happens when it's no longer about content, but it's about information and the movement of information between voters and the committees and candidates and things like that. And I don't know if we know where that technology is going just yet. To Bradley's big point is how do we use that to further engage people rather than create very personalized silos of which I don't actually have to talk to another human being. I just have to tell it what I care about, and then it spits me back out information. Is like, do we become even more siloed in our information ecosystems, or can it be used to draw people back into conversation with one another and back into civic life? And how do we do that?
That's a good question. How do we do that? I think that's probably one of the kind of core questions we're going to be facing over the next many election cycles. One thing that I was also thinking about as you both were talking is that is a lot happening in the ad tech space, in the private sector, in the commercial space, that informs maybe best practices, the best way, maybe the opposite of best practices. I don't know. When we think about politics, because the stakes are just so fundamentally different, but the technology is clearly very advanced already. We get hyper targeted content, hyper targeted ads all the time. So Bradley, I'm just wondering, as you think about kind of best in class, as you think about what's on the market, what tools exist for what you do, how much do you look to the private sector? How much of it is built purpose driven for polling specifically? And how do you think about that?
We do a lot of cross-pollination work, Julie, between our private sector clients and our political candidates, and trying to cross-pollinate, frankly, in both directions. In some cases, the political candidates are ahead of Madison Avenue, and in other cases, the opposite is true. I think one of the things that's missing right now, which is a challenge as a small business, as an investor in AI, is there is no national or global framework that exists right now. And I think New York State has taken some steps, if I can stand on a soapbox for a couple of minutes here, and trying to become a leader. But many states are auditioning very actively to be a state center for excellence. And I hope New York State has the leadership and the wherewithal, with your help, to play that role. I think there need to be federal standards rather than state standards. I think there's been a lot of conversation in Washington about AI. There doesn't appear to be any consensus. And I think it's important that we have bipartisan conclusions that we run towards together, because this impacts both parties. And I think when I talk with my Republican friends, I'm a Democrat, that many of us see this as a very significant national security threat if we don't handle it the right way. And that's in all of our interests, whether we're red or blue or purple or somewhere in between. I think the challenge for applying a lot of what you're talking about in terms of the leading edge corporate marketing is that in a lot of places, it doesn't scale down to small parochial issues and geographic areas like a city council district. AI and the algorithms run, and they need rocket-sized amounts of fuel to drive accurate algorithms, millions and millions of gallons to get a SpaceX rocket into the atmosphere, millions of bytes of data to create an accurate algorithm. I think about the city council race in the Bronx. Marjorie Velasquez was the incumbent. She lost her seat for the first time in 50 years to a Republican. That election was about literally one housing development in that city council district. And what AI doesn't have, what the best marketers on Madison Avenue don't have, is access to how that data has played elsewhere, because it was so esoteric to a very specific, nuanced neighborhood in the Bronx. And I think the scalability question is really where some of the limitations of AI are. And ultimately, as Julie's saying, is where people need to get back to talking to other people and engaging in them that way.
I'd love to dig in on that example. And first of all, I don't know if you know, but Marjorie actually works at Tech NYC now. She's our VP of
Yeah.
policy. So
Okay, I didn't know
let's
that.
just, here we go. Julie, I guess we could use that as an example. It was a very high profile local election. It did center on, as Bradley said, like hyper local issue about a specific real estate development. When you and your colleagues think about how to navigate those moments, we've got this great technology on the one hand, and on the other hand, you're talking about especially these local levels, especially in New York City, where we vote in off years, frankly, distressingly low number of people voting. How do you kind of think about using the more old-fashioned tactics? I hesitate to use old-fashioned, but I mean, like the way we've always done it versus kind of the application of a lot of these new technologies.
I think Bradley's point about scale is really important, and I think particularly across our industry, we have innovators, we have people who like to experiment, we have people, like to your earlier question, like pull from other parts of the technology ecosystem to figure out what are cool things that people are doing and how can we apply it to politics. The challenge is that we don't have the luxury of being able to break things. We have a significant responsibility to not just our clients who are candidates and committees, but kind of to our democratic process and our democratic values, right? And so how do we experiment in a way that respects that responsibility? And so I think that's part of why you see some hesitation right now in terms of the adoption in a lot of this stuff, particularly the more visible things like your generated ads and things like that, is because not just the challenge of a really complicated regulatory environment that we found ourselves in with different labeling requirements and different bans, and like it takes a lot to get skilled up. It takes a lot to be curious. It takes a lot of responsibility on the folks who own their firms to create use policies that their clients are comfortable with. And so I think that that's in part all of those challenges in the adoption of this kind of big technology really has led to people to experiment with efficiency of existing tactics and tools and strategies that we have. And so what I might say is, in the particular case of this like local election, is that that's in part what makes humans so important to this, is like you're still going to use your tried and true fundraising strategies. You're still going to use to, go out and knock on doors. You're still going to run some digital ads. You're still going to make phone calls. You're still going to have your volunteers and your rallies and all of these things. Like that stuff isn't going out of the way for a while. But what we are seeing it deployed for is like, how can I find the people who are going to be most influenced by a couple of issues, right? And how can I more personalize the outreach? Or perhaps I have a message and a set of 3 issues that I know works really well in this neighborhood. And then I can ask it again, what might work based on this neighborhood? Because the AI tool or the chatbot that you're putting it into might be able to access local or regional news publications or Twitter feeds right? Is so that it's able to kind of pull in a lot of context to help you answer it. But at the same time, it doesn't answer the question. It doesn't say this is the way to do it and this is the right answer. What I think people are using it for and can be most helpful immediately is to use it as a brainstorming partner of like, what are some options and tools? What are some ways of phrasing it? And then the human looks at it and says, that's wrong, that's right, that's interesting, or I think my client might really like this idea, right? And so it just kind of helps you work through the challenge. And I think that that's what's important, is it's like right now we're at the point of really building efficiency in the tools and in part making it more effective, saving time, right? It's a lot easier to like kind of plug it into a chat bot rather than trying to sit there for 20 minutes to try to write a fundraising email or a press release. So those things are also helpful whether you're on a Senate race or you're on a presidential. It's just like the number of people that are available to you to kind of do that work, it gets smaller and fewer as you get more and more local. But the context by which these tools are providing you answers is where I think the human is so important and will continue to remain important as we apply it to these tactics and tools.
Can I jump in on that? Because I think you've raised a couple of very important points. And this, Julie, is not the case with your viewership and listenership on the podcast, certainly not the case with a city and state audience. We have drilled down to voters that are active in supporting different political candidates and in our work for issue advocacy organizations. And they are not uniformly comfortable directly reaching out to an elected official to ask them to support or oppose a piece of legislation. People in city and state do that all the time, do it many times a day without thinking about it. But the average voter is reluctant or reticent to do that. Same thing when it comes to time to advocating for a political candidate to take on a certain issue, either supporting it or opposing it. The other place that we have done some development work, we built a piece of AI software called Civic Chorus, enables more connectivity between average voters and their elected officials, providing easier ways for them to share their perspectives in ways that are comfortable and not discombobulating to average people who don't consider them to be policy experts. And again, I think that's a place that's been very, very underreported in terms of how do we draw people out of their shells and advocate for themselves and advocate for their communities, in many cases marginalized communities, to their elected officials as their advocates. And the more that we can do that, the more that I think government and politics and public policy and business, frankly, is going to be responsive to the will of voters that have traditionally been left out of the traditional political process.
Bradley, let me drill down a little bit, if you're willing. Talk a little bit more about the product. Like, how does it, if I'm a voter, what does that look like to me?
If you're a target voter of an advocacy organization and there is a moment in the municipal or the state or the federal legislative calendar where it's important for you to speak up and speak to your elected representative, most people are not doing that. They often don't know that their voice matters. B, they may not know all that much about the legislative calendar. And three, may sound silly and superficial, they don't understand what the right mechanism is to reach an elected official. And if they do, they don't necessarily know what to say, and there is unease about whether they can articulate it in a meaningful way. AI gives them an ability to navigate all of those steps and be in touch. For some people, it's on social media. In some cases, it's a telephone call. In some cases, it's a text message. In some cases, people want to write a letter or send an email. There are a variety of different mechanisms they can use. What we don't have right now is a process for facilitating that kind of grassroots advocacy. Some call it grassroots lobbying. How do we get interested parties to have their voices heard? And that's where there's a big breakdown, I think, in people not feeling why government at all levels is not responsive to them.
I'm so interested in this, especially at the local level. I mean, here in New York, getting involved with the community board, for instance, is a huge time commitment. Not everyone can do that. But if we can break down some of those barriers, use technology to make it easier for average citizens to take part in those conversations, I think that's hugely important for democracy.
And Julie, what I would say is here is both. We've talked about the upside. Let me go in the other direction, talk about the downside. I've been on a couple of panels at Columbia University, which has a real focus around misinformation and disinformation. And it's a problem. We may want to talk about it on this podcast. It's certainly become, in my eyes, a global menace. The good news is that the media is lending a great deal of transparency, including this podcast, to getting voters to be aware that there is misinformation and disinformation that's in the ecosystem that we need to be ready for. Second thing is the country is so polarized right now, 48, 48, 49, 49, that if I'm a Harris voter, almost anything you say bad about Harris to me is going to be not anything I pay attention to. The converse is true on the other side. So at the presidential election, where there is the most amount of attention and focus, for the most part, misinformation, disinformation is less of a factor than a lot of experts warned about. Although we're not done yet, there's more to come and a few more October surprises we may be confronted with. When we go down the ballot, to your point about the local level, is where I grow more concerned. There's less knowledge, there's less interest, there's a lot less media attention. Several thousand journalists, a lot at the local level, have lost their jobs. Media outlets, including big net outlets, are not covering the local stories as much, and people are much more susceptible to misinformation and disinformation. We have done focus groups in the AAIP community in the aftermath of COVID and trying to understand how we can get more people vaccinated, came across massive amounts of misinformation, disinformation there. There is a great deal that's being pumped into Spanish language media which I think is impacting how those voters are viewing a lot of down ballot races. So I think this is where go down, down the food chain here. Maybe it's a little bit less sexy, not as much attention. That's where I see both the biggest threat and also the biggest opportunity to engage people or to re-engage people in this kind of work.
Yeah, Julie, do you want to respond to that? I think this is crucial.
I think that's why I kind of struggle is that a lot of 2024, like a lot of the movement that we saw from the policymaking perspective and AI in particular was like, how do we tackle the question of deep fakes, right? And the kind of the uniform response was let's put a label on it, make sure people are aware that it's been generated by AI. And I think that only goes so far. I think there's some research, some of which is getting put out by NYU, and some of our partners with the AI Political Archive that the AAPC Foundation has developed in partnership, which is trying to document all the uses of generative AI in the 2024 elections. We can kind of get past the moral panic and say, how is this actually showing up in our political communications this election cycle? So some of the research though says that perhaps labeling isn't the way to make people understand what they're seeing may not be truth and accurate, partly because of the thing that Bradley was talking about is that it's that kind of the disinformation comes first and the receptivity to the messenger is actually a lot more important than whether or not there is a disclaimer that says this is altered content on a political ad, right? And so I think the challenge with AI is that not so much, I mean, yes, deepfakes are a significant problem, and misrepresentation of candidates and also of the sexual content is such a problem that we have to be able to figure out and address. I think the challenge is, though, is that when we create a regulatory environment of which the good actors are so worried about how to use the technology, the bad guys are the ones who learn how to be more efficient, how to use the tools, how to do all of these things to exploit people. And the Supreme Court has said counter speech is the remedy that is available to us to respond to disinformation. But if we don't have people skilled in how to be competitive in counter speech, then disinformation is going to win the day, right? And so I think it's so important that our industry acquires the tools and the skills so that we can deploy this technology in an ethical and a responsible way, because we're not going to keep up otherwise.
I totally agree. And I think it's really important to regulate transparency around these tools. I think we should do that, but that is not the whole answer. I mean, think about some of the privacy regulations and how everyone just clicks on the accept all cookies. That's important, but that is not, is that stopping people? I think a lot about how we need multifaceted approach here. And a lot of it is public education as well.
I think there is a concern too, is that the same research that I talked about before shows that people have an immediate distrust of something they see as labeled as altered. And so if we end up using these tools to create content and only the good actors are labeling their content and the bad actors aren't, does it create a false sense of what is true and what is not true? Because the good guys are going to have an immediate upfront bias, and the bad guys are going to not have that because they're not labeling their content. And there's just, I think that is kind of a downstream effect that we need to take into account. I do think some of the watermarking, even though there's going to be a lot of chasing of the technology on the watermarking, could resolve some of this challenge of like, just saying something is altered or digitally altered is also not very educational or informative for the viewer, right? And so I think I'm looking forward to having continued conversations with policymakers about how do we do this right so that we're not setting ourselves at a disadvantage.
There is no, this is such an important conversation to have. There are unfortunately a couple of the swingiest counties in Georgia, the swingiest counties in Pennsylvania that are arguably going to determine the outcome of the presidential election. And their Board of Elections has seen their disinformation fighting budget go from $500,000 in one case down to $150,000. So we're getting ready for the World Series, and it would be like inconceivable to have the World Series and say we're not going to have umpires on the field. To extend the baseball analogy, the presidential election is going to be decided by roughly the number of people, 46,000, that can fit into Yankee Stadium. So you don't have to have broad-based misinformation that changes perspectives all across the country. It's really a game of inches here. And what I'm concerned about in terms of the ecosystem, Julie, building on what you were talking about earlier, is that there's not a national framework in place, that we're starting to see states trying to move in one direction or another, in some cases contradicting one another. And it makes it very, very difficult for commercial marketers, for political operators, marketers to operate in this ecosystem that's as fluid as it is right now. And again, I see that as a significant shortcoming that I hope groups like yours will address. The other thing that I saw, which is also alarming, is there's something like 450,000 unfilled jobs in New York State. We're not going to get immigration reform anytime in Washington in this political environment. Those are small businesses that are struggling to hire people, where AI can be a really important solve to helping them drive their businesses forward. And I worry about a patchwork quilt of local, state regulations that creates more headache and turmoil for small businesses, which are trying to be competitive and facing this very significant hiring shortage.
Bradley, can I hire you? I say this all the time. This is perfect. I totally agree. I mean, this is true. By the way, this is true with a ton of tech regulation, not just AI specific. It's hugely problematic that we haven't been able to get federal standards on a lot of these various issues for the reasons you point out. We only have a few minutes left, and I have so many more questions I want to ask you too, but I have two more specifically I want to ask. I was thinking a lot as you both were talking about some of the early movers and kind of what I think of as the last big round of campaign tech, which was social media. And, thinking back to the 2008 campaign and the ones immediately following, the local ones where candidates, usually younger candidates, really kind of figured out how to use those tools more quickly. And there was a lot of electoral benefit in being an early adopter in a lot of cases. And I'm wondering if you were seeing, this is a little different because a lot of the AI stuff is more behind the scenes, but I'm wondering if you're seeing another moment like that now where some candidates, some campaigns are able to essentially leapfrog in some ways their opponents because they're more open to experimenting with the technology, or if this is just like kind of all back office stuff that's less interesting.
I'll tell you, my example is I was a part of the 2001, 2005, 2020 Mike Bloomberg campaigns for mayor and for president ultimately. And what Bloomberg aimed to do with his enormous resources was to understand the city of New York voter by voter, city block by city block, and create personalized, custom content to each voter about why he was the better choice in that race. What we're seeing right now, Julie, is that power, this computing power, is being democratized so that you don't need to run for president or mayor or have anywhere close to his budget. We're putting these incredible tools in the hands of voters. And again, the reason I'm bullish is we're also going to be putting tools in the hands of candidates and campaigns to fight off disinformation and misinformation as well. So I see campaigning becoming a whole lot more customized to the needs of individual voters on often very esoteric issues. But if those are the ones that are motivating somebody to turn out and cast a ballot, that's what is most effective. So I think we're at a very important transformational moment here where the new normal for these campaigns is going to be harnessing enormous amounts of computing power to help them run more sophisticated races. And again, where I'm bullish about this is to reintroduce the American populace to the idea of participating in civic affairs because they're relevant and meaningful to their lives in ways they have not been with more generic one-size-fits-all messaging, which many people cast aside.
Sign me up for that project. Okay, I have a kind of a quick hit question and I'll close us out. It's a two-parter though. It might collapse into a single part, but I want to know if you guys, well, I want to know what you read what do you look at? We are in the run up to a very, very big election. What numbers are you looking at? What polls are you reading? And the second part, which again might collapse on the first, is what do you guys think of the betting markets? Do you follow those? For both of you. This is kind of a quick hit on the way out. Give some advice to the listeners on how to stay sane for the next couple of weeks here.
There was a time where I was an operative and a consultant and all those things. And so I was transfixed on kind of the political commentary of the day. I've got all of the hot sheets and everything in my inbox every morning. So, but I've actually spent a bulk of my time really trying to dive into this AI question, which has just opened up, I don't want to call it a Pandora's box, but I am doing as much as I can to learn and consume an entirely new universe of learning. So my nightstand reading has very much shifted in the last few years. But I think, I still got some Hal Malchos and whatnot, Sasha Eisenberg's on my bookshelf. So I think that what I am most the betting markets, it's kind of interesting because I think that we actually, as political consultants and operatives, have kind of a ethical consideration to weigh about whether or not we should be participating, and even kind of giving any credibility or credence to a betting market. Same way that you wouldn't expect a professional sports player to be participating in a sports betting program, right? That's been kind of my hot take on the issue. So I don't give them a whole lot of credibility at this point.
I love a hot take. That's why I asked the question. Bradley, what about you?
I have no money for betting. I have two teenagers who are eating like horses, and we're constantly refilling the refrigerator. So that's where our disposable income goes.
Very good. All right,
I
I'll
think
take
it's a
it.
very close election. It's going to go down to the wire. It's going to be litigated for a while. I think atmospherically, advantage Trump. I think based on some issues, advantage Trump. But on the other hand, that Trump is an overarching factor, and I think Harris is really trying to litigate very hard, putting Trump here center stage and making it a referendum on whether we want to deal with him again. But this is going to go down to the wire and be a historically close election, at least by the vote count, maybe not by the Electoral College.
Well, I really, really appreciate both of your time, both of your giving time today, especially because we are in your busiest season. And I know you have a million things you should be doing, and I'm going to send you back to them so you can land this Democratic plane smoothly. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you, Julie. This is
Thank
great.
you.
Wow, that was fascinating. That was actually better than I expected. I'm really eager to hear what they say 4 years from now. What was your takeaways, Julie?
I mean, my takeaways are that we're really living in a crazy time, which I think we all know, but it's so interesting. Well, first of all, I'm really grateful that the people who are in the business of working on these elections are thoughtful about the technology and are thinking about how to use it in the best ways possible, and also how to make sure that as these technologies become more widespread, we're making sure that voters are getting the best information possible. So they made me feel optimistic that
Okay.
smart people are thinking about these problems.
Yeah, it seems like polling is another industry that it requires some technological disruption. So I'm glad to see that there are smart people thinking about that. Before we sign off, I just want to thank our sponsors once again: Uber, Spectrum, Civic Hall, TikTok, Google, DoorDash, and Snapchat. Thank you so much for your generosity and for allowing us to get this podcast off the ground. Thanks, Julie.
Talk to you soon.